Good evening. The story you are about to hear is true. And by true, I mean it could happen to you. Perhaps. But what is certain is that after hearing it, its memory will keep you awake until the early hours of the morning. So close the doors, turn off the lights, and listen to this tale from our channel, Faceless Terrors. We find ourselves now in a typical American suburb, quiet and uneventful. It was a dark night. The glow of the streetlights danced ominously on the pavement. Each of the neighbors was getting ready to settle near the radio station or in bed with a good book when suddenly there was a noise outside, or rather, a sound. Strange and haunting, it grew louder, to the point where it could no longer be ignored. A few moments later, the neighbors had gathered on the street, sharing a palpable sense of unease. What was this strange sound? It sounded like a distant moan. The forest surrounding their neighborhood was shrouded in darkness, its secrets carefully hidden. A few minutes passed. Finally, the sound seemed to quiet down, and all that remained was the silence of the forest. The neighbors were about to bid each other good night and head home when suddenly a maniacal and shrill laughter tore through the night. There was a deathly silence. Then the laughter resumed, even louder. A freezing terror gripped everyone with each repetition of this sinister laughter that seemed to never stop. The neighborhood residents stood still, unable to say anything. Finally, after a few minutes, the laughter ceased. The neighbors remained on the sidewalk for a long time, staring into the darkness of the forest lying before them. But the laughter was no longer heard until the next evening. Throughout the day, the neighborhood debated who or what could have produced that indescribable, hair-raising laughter, unable to pinpoint it. And then, as night fell, at the same hour, it all started again. Intrigued, despite their fear, and above all determined to restore calm and peace to their little neighborhood, several neighbors decided to brave the darkness and venture into the forest. Among them, John, a young and recently married worker, went to get his gun from the garage, saying, "If this person or thing is determined to frighten us, then it will see what it's like to be truly scared." His young wife, Rachel, chose caution and decided to go home, waiting for the expedition to return. But as she headed alone towards her house, remote at the end of the street, the young woman heard footsteps just behind her. She slowly turned around. The shuffling figure of an old woman was approaching her. After a moment of irrational fear, Rachel recognized the elderly Mrs. Tatler, her neighbor. The latter, 80 years old and still vigorous for her age, didn't feel up to holding a gun in the middle of the night. Overcome with sympathy and not wanting to stay alone at home, Rachel invited her in for tea. Mrs. Tatler gladly accepted. At the table, they chatted for a long time. Mrs. Tatler was new to the neighborhood. She had been a widow for a few months and spent her time between sewing at home and long walks in the forest, which she found invigorating. After a while, Rachel realized they had been talking for nearly 2 hours, and her husband still hadn't given any news. Suddenly her phone rang. Rachel jumped and then let out a nervous laugh. She got up to answer the phone. On the line, John's voice reassured her. He was calling from the gas station near the forest road. John told her they had spotted a coyote in the forest and had decided to shoot him, thinking it was very likely the source of that terrifying laughter. Indeed, it's known that coyotes can produce cries similar to shrill laughter. Rachel immediately felt relieved and sighed. Finally, John told her he would have a couple of beers with the other members of the expedition before coming home. Rachel hung up. She returned to the living room and immediately reassured Mrs. Tatler. A coyote. It was just a coyote producing that awful sound. Can you believe it? Upon learning the information, Mrs. Tatler let out a small laugh, a laugh that grew louder, a laugh that soon ceased to be amusing. It was a maniacal laugh. Then the hideous and unspeakable thing that had pretended to be Mrs. Tatler removed her old lady costume, and Rachel screamed in terror.